Welcome to the Restoring Our City podcast. We are bringing you a very special series in this episode. We wanted to talk about critically thinking. If you joined us a couple months ago now, we had a great webinar called Critically Thinking About Being Woke, and we just started talking about different subjects with a special guest, Dr. Neil Shenvi, and my fellow collaborator and co-host with that event was Jeswin Thomas, and he is here with us.
Hey,
Jeswin, how's it going, man?
Pretty good. How you doing?
I'm doing good. And you know what? I'm actually excited about this kind of new series of topics that we're going to be talking about on this episode, because as a result of that webinar, we started to just talk about the concept of critically thinking, just about lots of different subjects in our society today. And so we wanted to bring that idea and that concept of critically thinking about our societal topics in the world today, especially as Christians in our community, and to stop being so polarizing. And I think we just wanted to bring our attention to the concept of critical thinking. So Jeswin, what do you think about when you hear that word critical thinking? Is that just a kind of mind-blowing concept to you?
Yeah, it's funny because I work in data. Just for those of you that don't know, I'm a data analyst. I look at numbers, and analysis is literally just critical thought. And so every single time I read something, every single time I look at data sets or anything that that's pertinent in my life, I'm always a skeptic. And so whenever I hear this word critical thought, it is, how do we be skeptical of whatever I'm looking at? Not taking something for the truth, but breaking it down to see, what do you conclude for yourself?
Yeah, and I feel like that's a lost art today, right? I feel like people are not critically thinking about topics. And if you're on Twitter or Reddit or whatever social media is out there, or Facebook, right? It's just kind of like you can see comments and people just have opinions on everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's not just, in the social media spheres. I think sometimes when we read, news articles, I was looking at a news article recently. I shared this with Jobbin earlier, but it said Seattle public schools will start teaching that math is oppressive. And, just on first thought, for many people, they might just read that article and just take that for truth. But I looked at it, I'm like, math, how is algebra, aside from making my brain hurt, oppressing me? It was just such an interesting way to think about it. Like, how do I actually critically think through even news media outlets nowadays?
That's an interesting. So there's an article out there that says, and I think this is from 2019. I have it up here. Seattle public schools will start teaching that math is oppressive. So I think if you talk to any high school student out there, they'll probably agree with you.
Absolutely.
Like, oh my gosh, math class. Except for maybe you. I think I know you love math.
I love calculus.
Right. But that's interesting. So like, just kind of looking at this article, people kind of have opinions on it, right?
Sure. Absolutely. And it's, how do we apply critical thought to this? How do we think through what exactly an article is saying, such as this one? And, necessarily not taking everything to be the absolute truth, right? I think sometimes we want to educate ourselves. We want to get out there. We want to read news. We want to be well-versed in the subject. But oftentimes we really need to think about, well, what exactly am I reading? What exactly is this saying? And just like you said, that critical thought is definitely a lost art. We don't want to just become mindless people that listen to subject matter experts. We want to learn how to become experts ourselves in thinking.
That's a great point. And I think the reason why we're having this episode, and we'll have a couple different episodes on various topics, is we can't be experts at everything, right? Like even some of the topics that we talk about, but that doesn't make it any less important, right? Exactly. Like that doesn't make it, I can't be a medical doctor, but I should know about my health and what I should do and shouldn't do. Right. When it comes to social matters or financial matters, I might not have a degree in those areas, but I have to be well informed, which critical thinking helps us do that, right?
Yeah. And even from, just thinking about us as a body in Christ too, thinking about the Christian community even more specifically, sometimes when we read the word too, it definitely tells us to be, as shrewd as serpents, but as harmless as doves, right? To really think. And even in Ephesians, it really talks about testing every single spirit, anything that's brought to us. How do we take this thought, this idea, this whatever captive and bring it before Christ first and really think through that?
I feel like our society today doesn't do that, right? So critical thinking, let's jump into it. I mean, so why is it important? I feel like our world is very crazy and it's polarized. And you just mentioned just a biblical approach. We're kind of called to do that too.
Right.
So,
And even, taking the biblically a little bit further, I think, sometimes in our world today, we're just as polarized as the world around us. But, honestly, as a body, we're called to be united. But I think even that is slowly breaking down, unfortunately. But how do we actually, bring unity within the body? And I think a lot of that has to do with, let's come together and think and talk and have substantive discussions without demonizing one another, even if we're on opposite sides.
so that's why I'm excited to have this conversation and for us to kind of go through a series of episodes with this, because whatever topic is out there, I'm sure you're going to find polar opposite ideas, right? And there's going to be people who are crazy about one side versus the other, but they also like demonize the other side. If you don't agree with me, you are blah, 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 blah. Right.
Right.
So like, what's the approach? Like, how can we actually help ourselves to critically think about topics?
Yeah. Jobbin and myself came together and we sat down and we were thinking about how do we do that. And one thing we realized is, what the heck, we may not even know how to do this properly. So we just started reading through, different ideas and different thoughts other people put together. But we tried to come up with a little framework for us to try to use in future episodes, as well, to take a topic and try to break it down systematically. And I think part of critical thinking is that systematic approach, as well. So, really thinking through, well, one, what's your question? Two, what are the different views on this question, this idea, this topic? Three, what is each of these opinions actually assuming? What are the assumptions? Four, are there objective measures that we can do to test some of these assumptions? And five, what are the implications when you make a choice? What does that actually mean for your life? Which might be a little bit of a scarier decision here. And finally, just to give the audience some perspective, well, we might give you our personal conclusions and we may disagree, and that might be okay.
Yeah. People can come to different results, right? Like different destinations. But like getting there, I think we shouldn't just like make knee-jerk reactions and conclusions, right? We should really take a systematic approach. I really like that breakdown too. And there's lots of different books and articles about how to critically think. And I'm sure a lot of folks who are listening have taken classes in that. And it's really a great way, but sometimes we just don't apply it to everyday life. So I kind of wanted to just take one of the articles that we saw in the news and maybe we approach it with maybe just this framework of how do we critically think about something. So Jeswin, I know you actually saw some interesting data in an article recently, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This was actually posted on Yahoo, but it's through NBC News. And it says Black people are more likely to die in traffic accidents, and COVID made this worse. And I was reading through this article, and just to give you some excerpts from here, it says an estimated 38,680 people died in motor vehicle accidents in 2020, the largest projected number of deaths since 2007. According to the U.S. Department of Transportation, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, long department right there, the number of Black people who died in such crashes went up 23% from 2019. The largest increase in traffic deaths among racial groups. And just to forward a little bit through the article, one of the questions that they had to answer is, well, why is that? And the conclusion comes to, well, Black people tend to be overrepresented as walkers in this country. This is not by choice in many cases. Black folks cannot afford motor vehicles, and people that walk in this country tend to experience a much higher rate of traffic fatality. So those are some excerpts from the article that I read.
Yeah, very interesting. So obviously COVID is still going, and it's crazy, and there's lots of different effects now that we are seeing, from variants and deaths, and there's lots of statistics out there. But this is a very interesting article that started to kind of correlate traffic accidents.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the conclusion that they drew from this was that Black people tend to be overrepresented as walkers in this case. This is not by choice. In many cases, Black folks cannot afford motor vehicles. So is it really tying some things together here?
And, Jobbin, I think the answer is it definitely is trying to make the conclusion that, hey, this 23% increase is true because there are more walkers. But one thing that we want to try to do here is let's critically think through this. Do they actually give evidence for this conclusion that they made?
Gotcha. So and that's interesting though, because like you can read an article like this and say, yeah, that's horrible. And I think that is horrible. Like when we see these, we're like, wow, let's find a solution for some of these issues. But at the same time, isn't that kind of dangerous where we see like stats and figures and conclusions that might not be from the source just thrown at your face? Like,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you're tackling, just like you said, if we're not creating a solution for the underlying problem, at the end of the day, we might not solve anything, right? And that is definitely a problem. I mean, how many times have I thought of, maybe starting a project at work, and I start off and my boss gives me a set of examples saying, hey, this is what I want done. And I assume, hey, well, this is probably how you want it done. And you get to the end, and then, she comes to me and it's like, hey, I like where you went with this, but this is not exactly what I was looking for. And you have to go back to square one and kind of restart, right? You spent all that energy tackling a problem that you were misinformed about.
right, right. And that's dangerous. And especially when you're dealing with people's lives. And I think, I try to think about these conversations very delicately too, because people might say, well, why are you criticizing an article that came out? I don't think we're criticizing it. I feel like we're looking at it to say, hey, if that makes me pause to say, does this really make sense? And it totally might, right? Like if we dive into the data and actually look at things, I think our goal here is to say, don't just accept everything that people throw at you at face value. Do some research, right? And like actually dig into it a little bit.
Right. And just like you said, I think more and more we are just getting our conclusions from conclusions other people have made and then we've read, rather than, once again, coming to that by ourselves. So just like Jobbin said, we're not trying to sway anyone back and forth one way or another. It's just taking some time to think. And so we hope that you think with us.
Yes, absolutely. And we'd love to hear from you on topics that you might be like, hey, what about this topic? What about this societal issue? Like we have a million that we can kind of review, right? Like there's so many things on the internet and people's opinions and kind of talking heads. I mean, we could be one of them, right? Like, but at the same time, instead of just saying, hey, this is what I think about it, we actually want to dig into it and research it a little bit. We might even come to the same conclusion, right?
Right. Absolutely.
But it's just don't read the, like I think there's something on Twitter now, like if you try to retweet an article without actually clicking and opening it, it'll say, do you want to read the article first? It's really interesting because it knows people just spout out headlines. They don't actually read the article, let alone the research. Right.
Right.
You know what's kind of my pet peeve now that you start talking about that is when I hear, because we live in Chicago, we both live in the city. When people talk about violence in the city, violence is down. Well, how do you measure violence? Like, what's your definition of violence? One thing that I saw recently on the news was an actual news network put out an article to say, hey, violence is down in the month of July. And it was like, okay, so people started responding. Well, what do you mean violence is down?
Right.
People getting shot is up, but the murders are down. But then like last year, the murders were slightly up and then the wounded was relatively the same. So it's kind of like, well, what do you mean violence? And that's like very vague term if you don't define it.
Yeah. And once again, just like you said, we all have our skews. And I think what's more dangerous is if we kind of lean into our skew and say, what supports what I already believe? And that, it's inherent in all of us, but that totally shows us where we're blinded to our lack of our own critical thought in the ways that we even present our opinions to others. Yeah.
That's a huge point. And I could think of so many topics. And I'm sure maybe if you're listening to this and you're like, okay, well, are you guys just talking about just this article? No, we're really talking about a bigger concept here. Like, how do you think about things and how do you draw conclusions? Because even that next piece of that framework is, what are the implications for choosing this view? How does this make you behave, or what's going to actually happen if you make this choice? Right. We were even talking, Jeswin, the other day, like growing up in church, there's ways that we've shaped our belief system and we've made choices based on what somebody told me to do. Right. And we didn't really critically think about it. Right. And maybe you grow as you get older and you get more knowledgeable, that starts to change. You actually start to critically think about things.
Right.
So it's interesting.
But what's funny is, just like you said, as you're younger, maybe you don't think about those things as critically, but as you get older and you start seeing those disagreements within, even our own churches and our own maybe families even, and start saying, wow, we really disagree on this. And you can't help but look at the other side and say, how are you so blind
Yeah.
to this part of it, right? And that is totally exactly the point we're trying to make. People all have our blind spots. And in fact, your opposition probably sees your blind spot way better than you because they're
Yeah.
critically thinking through what you've blinded yourself to. And it's definitely time that we open our ears to, hey, start listening to the opposing view a little bit. See if they have, really are catching things that we have totally just lost sight of.
Yeah, I mean, that's huge, right? And that's the goal of this. And I bet some people are listening to this and like thinking, oh my gosh, well, maybe I should start to question everything that I've ever believed. Well, now we're not talking about all this. We can talk about deconstruction and all that fun stuff later. But like, you know what I mean? Like, no, just critically think about things and like think through different opinions and discussions. And just like whenever somebody throws something at you, you talked about it up front, where we're not demonizing somebody else for having a different opinion.
Yeah.
But and even just we're not even doing this just to like sway you to another side of something.
Sure.
It's just like, no, how do you come to conclusions and come to it in a healthy manner, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So like looking at that last piece of the framework, we're not just going to come to a conclusion on just this article or whatever. It's just, it says, what is your personal conclusion, right? Like, do you see articles and do you read articles? Again, are you going to go through like this bullet by bullet? Probably not, but like maybe
Right.
it does cause you to pause a little bit and then say, hey, what's some data? I want to actually research this a little bit
Right.
before I make a decision, right?
And once again, just going back, we're not trying to necessarily just look at this article, but thinking more broadly, would we make that article my own personal conclusion, right? After I read through that, do I actually take that opinion or not? Personally, if I was to give a conclusion to this, I don't know if it's necessarily thought through the best possible way with the most amount of data. I think the verdict is still out there. I think we can still go and look and, hey, maybe I come back and say, I agree with this opinion, or maybe I come back and say I don't. But at the moment, I wouldn't necessarily take this to be my own personal conviction.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to kind of summarize it. And the reason why it's so important is because it's dangerous if you don't, right? Like if you don't think this way, if you say, hey, well, I don't have time. I just want to scroll and click on an article that catches my attention. But then also at the same time, you're following all the same like outlets and sources of information, especially with technology and the internet and social media, that might think or look at the world in a very specific lens too, right? So
right. I mean, how many times have we gone on social media and you just see person after person posting the same story, the same infographic, the same thing? It almost becomes its own echo chamber, and you start to say and take that as truth because, hey, all these people are thinking this way. If all these people are posting this way, it has to be true, right?
It has to be.
Without necessarily thinking and giving it a second thought.
That's the point. That's the point. It's funny because somebody sent me an article a couple of weeks ago from this guy, and I read through. There's two parts of the article. I read the first part, but then everything that I see this guy post is very like, I don't know, like snarky, if that's the best word to say. It's like he's just like always insulting people if you don't agree with him and stuff. It just really turned me off to even read the next part of the article because I'm just like, man, you don't even treat people with a dissenting opinion with respect. So why should I even take what you have to say with any kind of value? And maybe I should just look at it objectively, but it really turns me off when people are very demonizing and polarizing if you do not agree with what they have to say.
Right. I mean, even if, once again, from a Christian perspective, if we really think about it, we're called to be people that tell the truth. And sometimes we think, well, we don't care how people feel. We're just going to tell you the truth straight to your face as bluntly as possible.
Right.
But at the same time, we're called to tell people that truth in love. And there has to be that balance of both, right? And we see that perfectly within Christ, but we see that so imperfectly sometimes within the body.
Yeah. Totally true. And I think that's why we're having these conversations, not to just have a podcast to talk about, hey, let's talk to you about the most relevant news articles of the day, but like, how does it actually unify us as a community, right? Like, especially when I think about like restoring our city and like what we want to do and have these conversations. It's like everybody's having conversations now. You notice that? Like everybody's having their YouTube channel or whatever. And that's totally cool. But like, how can we have conversations but help unify us a little bit better? We think about the vast diversity within our country, right? Like lots of people are going to have differing opinions on things.
Yeah.
But I think we're called, like you said, to really come to very logical conclusions and sound conclusions, but not to be tossed by the wind. I actually want to read Ephesians 4, verse 14. So that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. That's really good. That's a word.
Yeah.
So,
and just to, add on to that, Joby, as well, just like you said, we're not just striving for diversity within our skin tones, within the body. We're also striving for diversity within thought as well. And sometimes a tactic that I've been seeing more and more of recently is whenever we see a polarizing topic, you see each side immediately say, hey, you as a Christian have to care about it and have to think about it in this way because it's the gospel. It is a gospel issue. And we always just bring it to that point so that we can stir up that care. And one thing that I wanted to bring out within this podcast too is, hey, not everything is a gospel issue. It takes sound doctrine, sound maturity, things that we got to think through and we can disagree on. But only the gospel is the gospel. And maybe if we took some time to share that to our world more and stop using it as a weapon so that we can get our viewpoint across to our brothers and sisters, maybe then we would see a little bit more unity within the body.
You should just drop your microphone right now. There you go. Literally the point, right? I think that's great. Sometimes we use it as a crutch, right? To maybe make people feel guilty, maybe even Christians.
Sure.
I think everything centers around the gospel, right? Mm-hmm. But like we can't just make everything about it when the message of the gospel is very clear, right?
Yeah.
And we try to distort it to manipulate it.
Yeah. And just like you said, the message of the gospel is so clear. And that's something else that I was thinking of too, right? The thing that makes me and you a brother in Christ is not our viewpoint on any topic that we can think of, whether it's racial justice, whether it is policing, whether it is a whole slew of topics from sexual or gender identity, whether it's even things within the body itself that we see, accountability issues, broken churches. Our opinion on any of those items is not what makes you a brother or a sister in Christ. It is our belief that Christ died for us and we all collectively deserve an eternity without him. And once again, if we could just keep that center and remember why we're brothers and sisters, we can have these conversations and disagree without that demonization that we were talking about.
Yeah. So the next time you're on social media, please think about that. Think about that. That next post before you hit send or tweet or whatever is just kind of like, hey, how am I treating this person if they are truly a brother or sister in Christ?
Absolutely.
I'm looking forward to this. And I want to encourage all of our listeners, you can reach out to us on social media as well. Send us your topic ideas. How do we critically think about blank? Insert topic there. Whatever you think we should address. If you want to jump on or have suggestions for folks to jump on and talk through it as well, we'll be happy to discuss and maybe break things down. And I hope that educates folks, but also in the end really brings people together, right? Like that's the whole goal.
Absolutely.
To stop being polarizing and start bringing people together. So
yeah, let's sit down at a table and let's disagree and walk away and eat a meal together. That's our goal.
Yep, exactly. So please send in your topic ideas, your questions, anything that you would like us to address. Jeswin and I will be looking forward to putting together more content on these topics. So critically thinking about blank. And just throw in whatever topic and you'll see some more episodes on that. So send it through our social media. You can always go to our Anchor website as well, anchor.fm/restoring our city. You can leave a voicemail as well if you just want to talk it out and leave a message and we can actually bring up your question on the podcast as well. So or drop us a DM through our social media website, our handles and reach out to us on our website too. So Jeswin, this is going to be fun. I'm excited about this.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Well, thank you, Jeswin, for being on. And we're going to bring you some more content on this. And thank you, listeners, for paying attention to these very important topics and thinking through things critically.